Brockport, New York, the Victorian Village on the Erie Canal was incorporated in 1829, 4 years after the completion of the Erie Canal. Its name derives from one of its founders, Heil Brockway. The village covers an area of 2.2 square miles and at 8,366 residents in the largest village in Monroe County. Brockport's pedestrian-friendly downtown of small shops and restaurants is listed on the National Register of Historic Places. The village prides itself on its public art, its canal front welcome center staffed by volunteers who greet boaters and Erie Canal cyclists, and its 9 public parks. Located 20 miles west of the city of Rochester and 11 miles south of Lake Ontario, Brockport is home to the College of Brockport State University of New York. Once an agricultural and manufacturing center, today's village industries include frozen food packaging and distribution and electronic recycling. In 1802, an Indian trail from Leroy to Lake Ontario was enlarged to open the triangular tract to settlement. The first settler on land that is now in the village was probably Kelvin Freeman in 1803. As the triangular tract became populated, it was carved up into towns of Bergen, Sweden, Clarkson, and Hamlin, and part of Leroy. The town of Sweden was organized in 1814. Land speculators Heil Brockway and James Seymour bought the land on the north edge of Sweden that is now Brockport and laid out the village in 1822. They had been merchants on the Ridge Road in Clarkson, but transferred their attention south 1 mile when they learned of the planned route of the Erie Canal. The canal is where it is in the village because it rests on the lip of the Medina Escarpment. North of the canal, the land drops off sharply to Lake Ontario, about 250 feet lower in elevation. 1 mile south of Brockport, the Niagara Escarpment is about 200 feet higher in elevation than the Medina Escarpment. At Lockport, where locks lift the canal from the Medina Escarpment to the Niagara Escarpment, the difference in elevation is only about 60 feet. The schedule for constructing the canal called for it to halt in Rochester in 1823, while the latter of the 5 locks was built at Lockport. However, James Seymour had a first cousin, Henry Seymour, and a business partner, Marion Hawley, on the Canal Commission, and they arranged for the canal to be extended to Brockport by October of 1823. Therefore, Brockport was the western terminus of the canal for 2 years. The last section of the canal from Brockport to Buffalo was opened in October of 1825. That opening from Brockport made it possible for the United States to become a continental power, and the rise of the United States was the most important political and economic event in the world in the 19th century. Before the canal opened, it cost $100 to ship a ton of wheat from Buffalo to New York City and required 3 months. As a ton of wheat was not worth $100, the land west of the Appalachians could not be economically viable. Canal transportation lowered the shipping cost to $5 to $10 a ton and the time to 2 weeks. Before the canal, every major American statesman expressed concern that the land west of the Appalachians could cease to be part of the Union because no particular means of transportation connected the two parts of the nation. Washington, Jefferson, Adams, Hamilton, Madison, Franklin, and so on, etc., all shared that fear. Britain wanted to extend Canada into the Midwest, one of the causes of the War of 1812. France wanted to recover the Louisiana Purchase. So did Spain. Adventurers like General Wilkinson and Aaron Burr wanted to create their own empire there. Also, the Erie Canal ensured that the Midwest would be populated mainly by Northerners. Southerners, led by Washington and Jefferson, sought to build a canal from Virginia into Ohio, but were thwarted by the mountains. New Yorkers had the tremendous advantage of the Mohawk Valley, the only break in the mountain range. This had major implications for the future of our country, especially with respect to the Civil War. If the Midwest had been settled mainly by Southerners, the balance of power in that great conflict might have been very, very different. Heil Brockway, co-founder of the village, was also heavily involved in canal trade. He operated a packet line between Rochester and Buffalo and had a boatyard that at one time built more canal packet boats than any other in the world. His son-in-law, Ellis B. Holmes, also owned a packet boat line. Brockport received its municipal charter on April 6th of 1829. The following decade was a period of intense growth and community organization. Its population grew from 798 in 1830 to 1,249 in 1840, a 60% increase. The charter provided the basis for the village government. The village was to be governed by 5 trustees elected annually, who were to choose one among them to be village president. Also elected for 1-year terms were 3 assessors, a clerk, a treasurer, a tax collector, a pound keeper, gatekeeper and overseer of highways for each of the 3 road districts, and 2 constables. The charter also defined their power. One of the first ordinances passed by the trustees created a system of fire protection, and the first fire company was the Water Witch Engine Company, number 1, in 1832. No board of health was provided by the charter, but popular demand led its creation in 1832. An active militia existed as a kind of quasi-governmental organization. Village elections were nonpartisan, but political party organizations were formed for participation in town, county, state, and national elections. Jacksonians, anti-Masons, National Republicans, and Whigs are all active in the early decades. The Republican Party came to Brockport with the founding of the Brockport Republic Weekly newspaper in 1856. The Democrats founded their own mouthpiece with the Brockport Democrat Weekly newspaper in 1870. The 2 papers merged in 1925 as the Brockport Republic Democrats. 1 district elementary school existed before the village was chartered. 2 others were established soon after, and the original one moved to a new building on Utica Street. Also, the village began its career in higher education by hosting a Baptist college. When that failed, the village took over its building for the Brockport College Institute in 1841. In 1867, it became one of the original state normal schools. Secondary education was provided by the BCI and the normal school. Religious life in the village became organized during that period also. The Baptists began a worship service in 1828 and built their first church to the site of the original schoolhouse at the corner of Main and Holly Streets. Methodists had been meeting as early as 1820 and built a church on Market Street in 1829. The Presbyterians began a congressional society in 1827 and built their church on State Street in 1831, where it still stands. The Episcopalians, if that's how you pronounce that, Catholics and Lutherans came later in 1838, 1854, and 1862, respectively. Benjamin Titus Roberts was the Methodist pastor from 1853 to 55 and began worship services for Nazareth separate from his ordained ministry in the structure of the King Street that had been a Free Baptist church in 1855. After leaving Brockport, he broke entirely from the mainstream Methodists and founded the Free Methodist denomination. Other organizations sprang up in the village during those early decades also. A temperance society was one of the first and largest of them. Leaders in that movement were Justin and Clarina Carpenter. After leaving Brockport in the early 1830s and divorcing Justin, Clarina became a leader in the women's rights movement, first in Vermont and then in Bloody, Kansas. She was a mentor to the young Susan B. Anthony. A Masonic lodge was quite strong at the beginning of this period, but dissolved during the anti-Masonic frenzy of the early 1830s. An Odd Fellows Lodge also existed intermittently during those decades. The only cultural organization in that period seems to have been a Lyceum, which was kind of an adult educate forum. Because of the canal, Brockport very quickly became the main market town and transportation hub for the area. As a result, it had a thriving business community. In 1830, an estimated 100 businesses existed in the village. As the census counted only 133 families, this means that 3/4 of the population earned its livelihood through commerce. By the 1840s, Brockport had developed a major industrial economy. It was the home of several iron foundries that produced stoves, tools, and threshing machines. In 1845, Cyrus McCormick came to Brockport and licensed the Backus and Fitch foundry to manufacture 100 of his newly invented reapers. Either they were never made or did not work, so he then gave the small license to Seymour Morgan and Company. In 1846, they produced 100 reapers that did work, thereby bringing the Industrial Revolution to agriculture. The reaper was so much more efficient than the scythe that, according to the American Heritage magazine, one man could do the work of 5. Therefore, the 165,000 reapers that were manufactured in the North during the Civil War released much manpower to serve in the Union Army and contributed to its victory. Again, according to magazines, many of those men were not needed on the farms after the war and migrated to the cities, urbanizing America and providing much of the manpower for the new factories, thereby industrializing America. The economies affected by the canal and the reaper had major consequences for life in Europe as well. The cheap American wheat transformed British life, for instance, leading eventually to the rise rise of democracy. Seymour and Morgan was the forerunner of a rash of Brockport manufacturing enterprises over the next 140 years or so. They included at least 6 farm implement factories and at least 9 food processing plants. Others produced shoes, buttons, bricks, dolls, fishing tackle, pianos, piano boxes, cardboard boxes, clocks, apple cores, refrigerators, equipment, card games, rotary pumps, sewing machines, wagons and buggy wheels, cooling boards for the undertakers, wagons and buggies, 2 automobiles, and galvanized tubs, buckets, sleeves, and cans. The era of manufacturing as the major industry in Brockport did not end until General Electric, Owen, Illinois, and A&P closed in the mid-1980s. Brockport also had major lumber business during the second half of the 19th century. Luther Gordon owned 7,000 acres of timberland in Michigan and shipped timber to his lumber yard and planing mill in Brockport. He shipped finished products all over New York State. After William Seymour retired from Seymour and Morgan in 1872, he went into lumber business with timber shipped by his son Henry from Sault Ste. Mary, Michigan. Lucius T. Underhill also was a big lumberman. As an example of the volume of lumbering business, they and several other firms shipped 5.9 million pounds of barrel stoves in 1860. In 1852, a young couple arrived in Brockport, where they would become its leading citizens. Daniel Holmes was an Ontario County boy who had been valedictorian at the Brockport Collegiate Institute and graduated from Yale. He had married Mary Jane Howes in 1849. She had grown up in Massachusetts and was a school teacher who had studied at Ontario Female Seminary. After settling in Brockport, Daniel studied at the University of Rochester and became a lawyer. He held many important civic offices: village clerk for 20 years, justice of the peace for 50 years, episcopal vestryman for 50 years, and member of the BCI and normal school councils for more than 50 years. He died in 1919. Mary Jane was also active in civic affairs, but gained celebrity as the leading American woman novelist of the late 19th century. She published the first of her 47 novels in 1854 and the last in 1905, 2 years before her death. Many women novelists scribbled away in the late 19th century, but Holmes was unique in that her works always portrayed ordinary people in everyday situations and eschewed supernatural events, violence, and anything unsavory. Moreover, she wrote in a style that was accessible to the average American housewife or teenage girl who was barely literate at the time. Finally, her heroines were strong, independent women who succeeded by their own effort and talent without male support. Because of this and her sales in the millions, her writings probably did more than any others to condition American women for the appeals of the suffragists and the feminists later on. 3 years after the Holmes arrived in Brockport, a baby was born to Anthony and Harriet Barrier and named Francis. The Barriers were African American. Anthony was a barber and coal dealer and a leading member of the First Baptist Church. Harriet taught Sunday school there. Francis always called Fanny, attended the Brockport Collegiate Institute, went south to study music in Boston and art in Washington. There she met and married a lawyer named Stephen Long Williams. They settled in Chicago and became top leaders in the civil rights movement in the Midwest. After Lang died in 1921, Fanny returned to Brockport, where she died in 1944. The Brockport area was heavily involved in the American Civil War. The village was much engaged in home front support for the war effort and recruited 7 companies, plus 1 from Hamlin, for the Union Army. In addition, at least 233 men from Brockport area served in units not recruited here. There is a compiled list of 845 men from the Brockport area who served in the Union cause. Collectively, they joined in every major battle and many lesser ones from July 18th of 1861 until the Appomattox Courthouse on April 9th of 1865. The most significant fighting of Brockport companies occurred at Gettysburg. On the second day of the battle, Brockport's Company A of the 140th New York Volunteer Infantry Regiment led an attack that repulsed a Confederate drive to conquer Little Round Top, the promontory that commanded the field where the decisive battle was fought the next day. On the third day of that battle, Brockport's Company H of the 108th NYVI played an important role in defeating Pickett's charge. The railroad came to Brockport in 1852, bringing an end to passenger travel on the canal. The spread of the rail network across the country also helped to doom Brockport's farm implement manufacturing industry. Rail transport was more efficient than the canal for its products. Seymour and Morgan responded to the threat by building a second plant near the rail line, but Brockport was not on the main line of the New York Central and suffered competitively. By 1900, the farm implement manufacturing industry had pretty much vanished from Brockport. The Johnston Harvester Company plant burned in 1882, and the firm rebuilt in Batavia. The Whiteside and Burnett Agricultural Works closed after Whiteside died in 1882, and Barnett retired in 1886. Dayton Morgan died in 1890, and his firm expired shortly thereafter. Clifford Morgan, one of Dayton's sons, converted D.S. Morgan's Plant No. 2 to the Rochester Wheel Works, but that business soon failed, and the building became Brockport Cold Storage, which still exists today as Bondula's Food Packaging Plant. However, the employment and economic benefits of the farm implement industry could not be replaced. Morgan's Plant No. 1 burned in 1904. The decline of the farm implement industry coincided with the drop in canal traffic. Business on the canal peaked in 1880, and even abolition of the tolls 2 years later could not make the canal competitive with the railroads. By 1900, it became clear that the canal could not survive in the form it then had. Under Governor Theodore Roosevelt's leadership, the decision was made to convert the canal from animal to mechanical power, replacing the horses, mules, and oxen by steam and diesel-powered craft. Most notable Brockport event happened in the 1930s was perhaps the trial in 1936 of the dog Idaho for having caused the drowning death of a small boy. Idaho was convicted and sentenced to death. The trial, as an oddity, attracted nationwide media attention. In the period after World War II, two developments profoundly affected the village economy. The first concerned higher education. In the 1930s, enrollment at the normal school had declined and state was considering closing it. Village residents organized a campaign to save it. A delegation met in Albany with Vincent Daly, political secretary to the Governor Lehman. Daly had been born and reared in Brockport. He told the Brockporters that they could keep their school, but would have to demolish the old building and have to build a new one on the same architectural plans as the one in Potsdam. In their presence, he called the state budget director and instructed him to include that in the budget. In the process, 3-year normal school became a 4-year school, state Teachers College, in 1940. As a result of that change, the handsome new building, and the influx of World War II veterans studying under the GI Bill, the school grew rapidly. From about 200 students in 1830s, it grew to 2,900 in 1966. In 1962, it was designated one of the 13th comprehensive colleges in the State University of New York. Under the leadership of President Albert W. Brown after 1865, it shot up to over 12,000 students about 1970 before settling down to a steady enrollment around 8,500 thereafter. To accommodate the increased enrollment, a major building program was undertaken, and the campus was expanded greatly, involving the demolition or removal of many village homes west of the old normal school campus. The second major post-war development was the resurgence of the manufacturing industry. General Electric came to Brockport in 1948 with a 150,000 square foot plant that produced all of its small appliances for the domestic market and employed as many as 1,100 workers. In 1961, Owen, Illinois built 350,000 square foot state-of-the-art glass factory that employed 700 workers at its peak. GE sold its plant to Black & Decker in 1984, and Clean Bright produced cleansing powders there from 1889 until about 2001. The building has been vacant since then. Owens, Illinois closed in 1985, and its plant was demolished. The only remaining industrial facilities in the village are the Bondula Food Packaging Plant that employs about 270 workers, and a very small food sauce company. In the 1960s, Brockport became infected with the urban renewal fever. The village board adopted a plan to demolish much of its historic downtown commercial district and open the area up to a marina on the canal. They had detailed plans drawn up and had arranged for the financing. When the citizenry rose up in revolt, they threw the rascals out and elected Frank Satchel as mayor on a write-in vote. Thus was saved the finest array of Victorian commercial buildings in the area. 45 of them are now on the state and national registers of historic places.